So hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our Reimagining Childhood Studies series. My name is Sharda Balagopalan, and together with Spiro Spiru and Rachel Rosen, we are organizing this series. We are really pleased by the interest in this series and the appetite for critical engagement. We had around 208 people registered, and I think people are still coming in, and we have about 70 people in the room now. And we had over 200 join in the first two webinars. So please note that only the panelists can use their videos and their mics, but we invite you to use the chat function to introduce yourselves, which a few of you have already begun doing. We have organized these webinars slightly differently than the traditional childhood studies panels by taking up three concepts and ideas to date that haven't been widely mobilized in childhood studies, but are part of a broader scholarly discussions. We are using these seminars to consider the concept's productivities for childhood studies. Our hope is that in doing so, we can push the doxas and boundaries of current thinking in the field, even if the concepts prove problematic or less than productive, although we hope that this is not the case, and open up new ways and bring insights from childhood studies to these broader developments and debates in social theory. Before going on to introduce our topic for today's webinar, I would like to share with you our plan for the webinar and some practical details. For today's event, we have three distinguished scholars who will offer us their insights into liberalism's erasures as it relates to childhood and childhood studies. These scholars are Paula Austin from Boston University, Karen Wells from Birkbeck, University of London, and Veronica Pacini-Cacciabau from Western University. Welcome to all three of you. This part of the webinar will be coordinated by Rachel. The remaining time will be devoted to questions and answers. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function, which can be found by hovering over the bottom of your screen. Please include your name and affiliation when you post your question. The Q&A session will be coordinated by Spiros. And just to clarify, the regular chat function will be open for comments and discussions the whole time. Please also note that the webinar is being recorded. We plan to make these webinars available to those who cannot attend and to create an archive for students and scholars engaged with the project of reimagining the field. And now I would like to say a few introductory remarks about liberalism's erasures, the topic for today's webinar. In this last webinar, we would like to tie together the conversations we've had on reimagining childhood studies, refusal, and slow violence by inviting our speakers to think with and across theoretical frameworks that have challenged liberalism. For quite some time now, critical scholarship around race, indigeneity, disability, feminism, neo-Marxism, de-colonialism, and postcolonialism have productively interrogated liberal certitudes. These theorizations coalesce in their attempts to historicize liberalism's moral assertions, politicize its ethics of neutrality, and recognize, as well as rework, its ongoing devaluation of particular lives. Blending together archival and contemporary analysis, they offer critical frameworks that invite childhood studies to diagnose and go beyond the recuperative, isolated, and dehistoricized valorization of liberalism that underlies some of its current assertions. And there are three ways in which they do this. First, their sharpened theorizations around the paradigmatic figures of the slave and the indigenous as those who were ontologically barred from the category of the human in settler colonial contexts has disrupted the progress narrative that marks contemporary debates on liberal citizenship and rights. Moreover, their unmasking of the symbiotic relationship between colonizer and colonized has helped highlight how racial thinking shaped normative evaluations of cultural and civilizational distinctions, of which childhood was a key site, and also pathologized and infantilized entire populations. Second, The self-conscious historicizing of liberalism has also aided in dislodging an entrenched pattern of viewing the contemporary liberal state as neutral. Through politicizing the quotidian ways in which oppressive power circulates through racialized and other culturally dominant valuations, including heteronormativity and caste, for examples, scholars have exposed how things like the rule of law, meritocracy, and equal protection serve to exacerbate existing hierarchies and neutralize the enduring effects of historical exclusions. In addition, the renewed focus on capitalism, racialized and structural exclusions have made visible the deep entanglements between slow violence, dispossession, and the biopolitical sorting of populations, not only in settler colonial contexts, but within the logics of economic development in post-independent states as well. By setting in place a new conceptual language that disturbs the self-evidence of liberal statecraft, these theories push us to reckon with the carceral state and the school-to-prison pipeline, recognize the subaltern as a figure of persistent disenfranchisement, and re-examine the terrain of politics as that which includes necropower, or the state's right to kill, as more potent than biopower. Third, they also alert us to the epistemic devaluation of the everyday lives of a majority of the world's marginal, non-white peoples, and have worked to bend research towards recognizing the value of alternate ontological, methodological, and political frameworks. These include, for example, Gayatri Spivak's efforts to reframe responsibility as a half-archive sensibility that has been attenuated in post-capitalist societies, Saidiya Hartman's efforts to break open archival documents through critical fabulation to provide a richer picture of the transatlantic slave trade and Black social life, and Audra Simpson's efforts to rethink indigeneity through a politics of refusal rather than a politics of recognition. Our aim with this conversation today is to explore the potential and utility of these critiques of liberalism to reimagine certain key assumptions within childhood studies. We are asking commentators to reflect and draw upon these theorizations to identify how they have and could be usefully applied and elaborated. We are also asking the panelists to retain a critical outlook and consider what the limits of these theorizations might be. So some of our questions include, how does these frameworks' powerful historicizing of liberalism's cultural, social, psychic, and material practices in settler and non-settler colonies compel us to critically open up childhood studies' understanding of children's subjectivities, including the dehistoricized valorization of agency? And second, given how these theorizations highlight the exploitation of marginal non-white childhoods as neither contingent nor haphazard, how might a more politicized framing of liberal settler and post-independent states, politics of accumulation, racialized capitalism, and slow violence fundamentally complicate existing understandings of children and futurity? And third, how might we work to epistemically include marginal children's cultivation of everyday forms of knowledge, including their refusal, as that which often exceed and fail to neatly fit within their representations within narratives of pain?
Thank you, Sharda. It's my real pleasure to introduce our first speaker today. Paula Austin is an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Boston University. She is a US historian with a focus on Black history, the history of race and racism, visual culture, education, women's history, and the history of childhood. She's the author of Coming of Age in Jim Crow, DC, Navigating the Politics of Everyday Life, published by NYU Press. And she also facilitates professional development on equitable and inclusive pedagogy. I'm really looking forward to her talk today, which is entitled Fistfights, Swimming, and Street Protests: What Black youth politics looks like when politics are foreclosed. Paula, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good day. Thank you so much for asking me to participate. I am going to attempt to share my screen, and also, I will say, attempt to stay on Zoom because my laptop has been crashing repeatedly for no good reason. So I hope that I do not disappear in the middle of this. I'm especially thankful to be included, given that I am sort of not officially in childhood studies per se. I'm a historian. I work in research Black history in the US. And I really started out my historical research in looking at the history of US education and its relationships to race and ethnicity. I was an adult literacy teacher for a while. I taught developmental reading and writing in the community college, at the community college level in New York City for many years. And I was really curious about why so many of my students were students of color, were Black and poor and working class and immigrant students, and all of those simultaneously. And so this was sort of the beginning of my understanding of structural oppression and the history of racial capitalism and its manifestations in the US context, and then thinking kind of broadly about Black diaspora. So some of these images might be familiar to you. The one on the upper left is Winta Amor Rogers, who was 5 last summer when she was recorded making a very vehement protest chant. And there was lots of kind of reaction to her engagement in the protests last summer. And I think she was maybe on Long Island, in Long Island City in New York. And the kind of reaction was interesting to me because there were lots of people who were sort of like, you know, this is amazing. And then and folks who found hope from it, but there were lots of folks who also was thinking about her lost childhood. And I was sort of like, well, actually, there are lots of people who have quote unquote lost childhoods because they have not historically been thought about as children and have been adultified. And this is especially true for Black young people. And so, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the context of the research that I did that became coming of age in Jim Crow DC, and why these questions about a critical reimagination of childhood studies, one that is deeply inclusive of young people's authorial subjectivities of their inner lives and interiority. The last two things were sort of the things that I was most interested in thinking through. And I think the images here are really the background, historically and contemporarily background realities to what I was thinking about as I was working on this historical project. And of course, this week in particular, the backdrop of the Derek Chauvin trial here in the US for his murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis last May, and the testimonies of 2 young people this week who were witnesses to the cruelty and violence, including Darnella Frazier, really whose courage led to the existence of the video that so many around the globe have seen now. When I started this research as a graduate student, the movement for Black Lives was really just emerging, sort of solidifying and concretizing and really galvanizing around 3 murders of Black young people, in particular, Trayvon Martin, who was 17, Michael Brown, who was 18, and Tamir Rice, who was 12. Ayanna Stanley Jones, who was 7, had been killed a few years earlier in Detroit. And the pervasive sort of narratives of fear of Black young people, Black boys in particular, the adultification of Black young people in general was and continues to be, and historically has been, a relatively normal narrative. And I think for the young people that I look at in the book is particularly amplified in ways in urban spaces because of the greater number of people and unavoidability of contact. So, so I came upon the narratives or the voices, I should say, of the young people who ended up in the book quite randomly in 2010 or 2011. I went looking in E. Franklin Frazier's papers for his interviews with Black families. And for those of you who don't know E. Franklin Frazier, he was a prominent Black sociologist in the US in the early 20th century. He's probably most famous for his Negro Family in the US book, which then was used by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan to write his report in 1967 that essentially problematized and pathologized Black mothers and Black young people, specifically daughters, but not only daughters, sort of especially working class Black families in urban centers. And in 1934, Frazier took over the sociology department, became chair of the sociology department at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And he was a graduate of the Chicago School and strongly influenced by the Chicago School's social scientific assimilation model and by W.B. Du Bois's concepts on the impact of industrialization and institutionalized racism on Black workers. So under his leadership at Howard, he kind of oversaw the assessment and survey of not just local Black communities, but national Black communities around recreation, juvenile delinquency, truancy, poverty, infant mortality, family formation, migration, and he had kind of a large group of researchers, students, social workers from across the country, really, who worked with him, sorority members who worked with him to do some of the research. So what's interesting about his research is that they were Black researchers who were researching in Black communities, so different than, say, the WPA research that is happening at the same time. So a significant number of the studies that Frazier and other social scientists at the time were doing were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and their support of the federal agency that was the American Council on Education. And I think it's important to talk about the Rockefeller Foundation in a conversation about liberalism, because the foundation really was at the heart of funding social science research. They funded the Social Science Research Council, which was founded in 1923 by Charles Merriam, who was a political scientist. And it was the SSRC was really promoting kind of these new interdisciplinary directives, encouraging social scientists to work together. Merriam was a sort of proponent of behaviorism, which was a concept that was being used at the time to examine and understand sort of people's capacity to fully participate in democracy, you know, kind of in the midst of mass migration, kind of advancements or developments in enfranchisement, economic depression, authoritarian movements right across the globe, totalitarian states, world war. So SSRC was really and the Rockefeller Foundation was really at the center of trying to look at sort of what was happening in communities around the country anyway, and kind of figuring out specifically in terms of workers, how to help workers, mostly poor and working class people, Black and brown and immigrant, in sort of getting it together in these new developing urban spaces. So I wanted to share with you kind of in response to some of those questions, two young people's interviews which were really kind of robust in the archival materials that I looked at. And I think that for me, they are important materials to share because they get at the issue of refusal, and I think the issue of being able to sort of taking for granted not just agency, but subjectivity. And I think this is what's interesting about the interviews that were done by Frazier, because despite the fact that he takes a lot of liberties with the interviews that he did, and his kind of political agenda for what he's trying to do with his findings is, you know, maybe we could debate on whether or not it was a good political agenda or not. I mean, he's essentially trying to impress upon the federal government that racial segregation is, I don't know that he would call it violent, but it was having a deleterious effect on, specifically on young Black working class people. But the liberties he takes actually, while taking agency and subjectivity for granted by asking the kinds of questions that he asks of the young people, he also, which of course leads me to be able to think about what they're saying in the interviews in a particular way. He also he also ends up not representing them in the book that he publishes as a result of this research project, Negro Youth at the Crossways, in a very honest way. I mean, he manipulates some of this. And so this is what I found most interested in listening to the young people talk in these interviews are the ways in which they are very clear about the juxtaposition between the symbolism of the US capital city that they live in, and the racial violence of the US capital that they live in multiple forms. So not just in terms of legal racial segregation and housing covenants, but also the discrepancies between the experienced and built landscape and the imagined landscape, just as the US capital, as Washington, D.C. is kind of trying to position itself as a global imperial, the seat of Western democracy at this, in the early 20th century, at the turn of the 20th century. I was also interested in how the young people were, so not just thinking about these contradictions, but really navigating these contradictions physically. So really, I was thinking about Catherine McKittrick's work, Geographic Beings, and thinking about how the young people are using their bodies to really intervene in the confines, the enclosures of racial segregation. And there was a really great quote at the end of my work on the sort of copy editing of the book that I found, I used a lot of material from slavery scholars, from, folks like Jennifer Morgan, and all of the folks who are doing work right now in Black girlhood studies. And so I was using a lot of their theorizing. And just as I was finishing, Saidiya Hartman's book came out, and there was a really great quote in it where she says, "What better articulates the long history of struggle, the ceaseless practice of Black radicalism and refusal, the tumult and upheaval of open rebellion, than the acts of collaboration and improvisation that unfold within the space of enclosure?" And so I really saw the not just the movement and the thinking, but then some of the kind of more traditional forms of activism that young people were engaged with as this, not just Black radicalism and refusal, but also collaboration and improvisation, and thinking of DC as a space of enclosure, racially segregated DC as a space of enclosure. So I want to share with you a couple of just two young people and their experiences and some of what they say in the interviews. These two images here on the slide are actually from an anti-police brutality protest that happens in 1938 in Washington, D.C. And the young people are referencing some of their interactions with police in the interviews that they do. This was there was a kind of long anti-police brutality campaign that was happening in DC at the time. And then this is one of the images from one of the rallies that happens. The young people on the left are actually flanking a car that is carrying the widow of the latest victim of police violence in DC. So I'm going to just stop sharing so I can tell you these two stories. So one is Susie Morgan, who was 14 when she was being interviewed. The other is Myron Ross, who was 17 when he was being interviewed. They both lived in Southwest DC, which was sort of thought to be the roughest quadrant of the four-quadrant city. And is described by some of Erasure's researchers as not well paved, replete with shacks, lined with piles of junk trash tin cans and piles of fresh manure. Because Southwest was a poor and working class neighborhood, mostly Black and white ethnic immigrants, it was slated for renewal, essentially from the turn of the century into the 50s, when it was indeed renewed. Folks were displaced, and there was demolition of the neighborhood, generally meant to make room for, and this was sort of the plan, was to really make room not just for the growing monumental core in DC, but also to make room for federal offices as a result of the New Deal, and also for housing for federal employees. So because Susie and Myron's interviews were sort of the thickest, it was really clear in those interviews the ways in which they were aware of the contradictions of this juxtaposition of the federal government and the symbolism of freedom. And then with this stark reality in mind, they really are sort of moving about the city, claiming, occupying, repurposing spaces, and really being able to articulate kind of how they're thinking about racial violence and racial segregation. So one of those stories is Susie explaining one of her interactions with cops in DC, and she talks about her friends intervening and interrupting DC segregationist policies when they go to swim in the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool, and when they are playing and frolicking in the Union Station Columbus Fountain, which were sort of two of the places that Black young people went to cool off in DC's hot summers, because there was only one designated Black swimming pool. And so Susie tells this story of swimming in the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool, being essentially threatened and kind of menaced by DC police. And the young people kind of do this political theater while they are in the reflecting pool, where one of them pretends to be Abraham Lincoln and kind of, starts speaking as Lincoln. They ask Lincoln permission. They say, "Mr. Lincoln, you won't let him bother us, will you, Mr. Lincoln?" referring to the cop. And then Lincoln responds through one of the young people and says, "No, indeed, you all stay down there and swim till you get ready to stop." And they kind of have this back and forth with Lincoln. The cop is sort of losing it, and threatening them. And they are just kind of moving around, evading him. And at some point, the cop leaves and to go get help to get them out, and they escape out of the reflecting pool. But this was one of the first interviews that I came upon. All the interviews were anonymized, and so I made some assumptions about who was telling the story. I actually assumed Susie was a boy. We can talk about the gendered problems there later, but I thought it was so interesting that she narrates the kind of this intricacies of her political understanding of her politics, and reterritorializes the space, does this political theater, but then also is able to kind of mobilize this history of Lincoln and an understanding of who he is supposed to be. Again, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I've gone completely over time. This always happens to me. I will. So I won't tell you the story of Myron Ross, but I want to share with you one of the last things that Susie says in her interview, which really spoke to me in terms of her very serious awareness of her, not just her political thinking, but also her political power. And when she's asked about this, kind of this interaction with the cop, she says, "Of course, we know we ain't got no business there, but that's why we go in." And to me, it was like, I think, to me, this represented her very serious political awareness and her understanding of her own ability to intervene in these geographies of containment. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to be quiet now.
Paula, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating, and I think a really compelling case study of the limits of liberalism, the gaps, the fissures, and the stories you found in the archive that really show this really brilliant repurposing, reclaiming of spaces of liberalism, even in the context of American imperialism. So thank you very much. I'd now like to move on to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Karen Wells. Karen is a great colleague. So it's lovely to have her here. She researches the intersections between international political economy and sociocultural fields in the formation of childhood. She's a professor of human geography at Birkbeck, University of London, and the author of Childhood in a Global Perspective, which is now in its 3rd edition, Childhood Studies, Making Young Subjects, and Visual Cultures of Childhood. She's currently PI on principal investigator on 2 research projects, Development and Education in the Vernacular, and Tamari, Teaching and Learning in English Medium Schools, and is speaking to us, in fact, from Addis, where she's involved in working on one of the projects. Her talk today is called Liberalism and the Erasure of Non-Productive Futures. Karen, welcome. Sorry, Karen, can you?
Okay. So, so liberalism and the erasure of non-productive futures. So what I want to suggest in this paper is that the governing of childhood disability and the governing of juvenile justice can be theorized as connected instances or examples of liberalism's erasures. So I'm taking this concept, which I've never really come across before, to be honest, but anyway, I'm taking this concept of liberalism's erasures to mean what realities do liberal political economies and the socio-cultural formations they reproduce erase in order to sustain the credibility and efficacy of the liberal project, obviously on its own terms. Related to this, for me, is a question of what is the liberty in liberalism? What is the freedom that liberalism wants to cultivate? And how does this relate to the imagined futures of children, particularly of Black, working class and Indigenous children in liberal political economies? So I just want to say a bit about what I mean by productive. So my focus, as it says in the title, is on the erasure of non-productive futures. And so what I mean by that in relation to childhood studies is that child rights and the child saving that both produce child rights and continues to animate or be imbricated with child rights are fundamentally about cultivating and developing the productive capacities of the child, whose imagined future is that of a productive adult. And productive here does not mean active, alive, generative, dynamic, social, etc. It simply means activity that adds value to privately owned capital. So that's the imagined future of the child. That's what all that energy is going towards. So a bit of background or framing. My perspective on this, as is probably obvious, is centrally informed by Marxist analysis of liberal political economy and the theorization of racial capitalism developed by Cedric Robinson in Black Marxism, Clyde Woods in Development Arrested, Karen and Barbara Fields in Racecraft, of course, Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore in her work on abolition and carceral geographies, and also my colleague at Birkbeck, Sarah Keenan's research on the production of race and its relationship to the transfer of land title in colonial South Australia that treated land as new and, quote, without history. So what I take from these connected theorizations is that the freedom in liberalism is the legal freedom to accumulate private property through the appropriation of land and labour and the concomitant shift from social to personal wealth, or maybe collective to personal wealth. And this freedom from the onset rested on an almost moral, indeed often religiously sanctioned repulsion towards unproductive land and unproductive human activity, where unproductive means not leading to the private accumulation of capital on one scale or another. As the theory of racial capitalism shows, the accumulation of private property and the inequalities these practices inscribed produce race as a system of classification and naturalization of systematically produced inequalities, dispossessed people of their land through various legal fictions of non-productivity and emptiness, tied to emergent concepts of race and indigeneity, and connected the freedom to accumulate to whiteness. And then to place children within this theoretical framework, I think we have to abandon one of the central tenets of childhood studies, which is that we're primarily concerned with children's lives as they are lived, rather than with the adults they will become or how their childhood will structure this adulthood. What I'm suggesting is that the architecture of children's rights and of child saving is primarily intended to ensure the development of the productive forces of the child and to sort the imagined productive futures from the imagined unproductive futures. And therefore, as childhood studies scholars, we have to re-attend to these imagined futures. Furthermore, while I don't want to reanimate the theory of a reserve army of labour that keeps capital waiting in the wings until such time as it can be absorbed, I think we are witnessing the construction of human beings as waste or excess that needs to be contained or indeed disposed of where possible. Specifically in relation to childhood studies, what I'm suggesting is that what is conceptualized as child protection in juvenile justice and in the governance of childhood disability is about the imagined future of children as adults in relation specifically to their productive potential or freedom to contribute to the project of the private accumulation of capital. So first of all, to talk more about juvenile justice, and to take this as an example of how children are managed or governed when their imagined futures are unproductive, or to put it another way, the building of a child-welfare to prison pipeline, welfare here obviously meaning the institutions through which the state supposedly acts as a caring parent to the child in the absence of their own parents' care. The child in this welfare-justice system is already presumed to be a child at risk of becoming a non-productive adult. As is well known, the juvenile justice system, first established in the USA at the end of the 19th century, aimed to rescue the neglected child to prevent the emergence of the criminal adult. And central to this possibility of rescue was that the child concerned was malleable and redeemable. Given the racist underpinnings of racial capitalism, it is unsurprising, but nonetheless, of course, reprehensible, that this presumption that children are redeemable was primarily targeted at white children. Black children, and especially Black boys in conflict with the law, were and are more likely to be diverted into a criminal justice response than a welfare response, as Jeff Ward has shown in his book, The Black Child Savers, with the court waiving their jurisdiction over some children who were and are tried and sentenced as adults in the criminal court. The racist structure of juvenile justice rests on the presumption, indeed, is part of the active construction of the imagined future of Black children as non-productive Black adults. The disproportionate detention of Black children in the juvenile justice system and the disproportionate waiving of juvenile courts' jurisdiction over Black children who are then tried as adults in adult courts are the material effects of this imagination of Black children's futures within the so-called welfare system. Once in this system, their protection from arbitrary violence is extremely limited. To give just one example, the international firm GEO, one of many private firms that manage child detention in so-called welfare-justice systems, held a contract for the management of the Walnut Grove Youth Correctional Facility, a 1,500-bed prison for boys and young men aged 13 to 22 who were in the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections. It opened in March 2001, and was for the incarceration of boys and young men who were convicted as adults in criminal court. Between May 2001 and March 2010, the population tripled from 350 to 1,200 adolescents, of which 20% were white and 79% were Black. It was investigated from 2010 to 2012 by the US Department of Justice for its infringement of the constitutional rights of youth. They found that youth were subjected to sexual abuse and excessive force by staff, that peer violence and suicide risks were ignored, and that staff were employed who were known to have gang affiliations. The Department of Justice reported that, quote, the sexual misconduct we found was among the worst we have seen in any facility anywhere in the nation. This is the Department of Justice talking. I mean, if they think it's bad. Southern Poverty Law Center, together with the ACLU and civil rights attorney Robert McDuff, sued the Mississippi Department of Corrections in 2010 in a class action suit, alleging a culture of violence and corruption that endangered youths, including a young man who suffered severe brain damage after being stabbed and beaten in a brawl that Department of Justice investigators later wrote had been endorsed by a guard who allowed prisoners into an authorised cell to fight. The SPLC and co-counsel reached a settlement that required the state to move children and teens into a separate facility and no longer subject them to solitary confinement. Just leave that there for a second. Solitary confinement for teenagers who were supposedly in a welfare system. In approving the settlement, the District Judge Carlton Reeves wrote that GEO Group has allowed a, quote, cesspool of unconstitutional and inhuman acts and conditions to germinate. Despite the Department of Justice report and the comment of Judge Reeves, GEO continues to manage youth detention and other youth facilities. They have a youth and family services group, Erasures, which they acquired in 2010 from Cornell Corrections, who've had their own history of class action suits. And they run 12 residential and 7 non-residential facilities in the USA with over 1,200 beds. One of these facilities in Austin, Texas, can house up to 139 children between the ages of 10 and 17 who are experiencing emotional, behavioural, psychological, educational and social problems. Some are in care, some have come through the juvenile justice system. In 2019, a 15-year-old girl died by suicide at the institution. In the previous 3 years, it had been cited 49 times for violating state standards. Extraordinarily, it's part of Texas's foster care system, which itself is the subject of class action suit in 2011. In 2015, a federal judge ruled the system unconstitutional, finding children, quote, almost uniformly leave state custody more damaged than when they entered. How can we understand and theorize what is going on here? Is this children made bare life in a state of exception for those whose imagined futures fall outside of the freedom to produce and to contribute to the accumulation of private capital? I'm just going to leave that there. Maybe we can pick that up in the discussion. My second section is about childhood disability and trying to connect these two things. So the governance of autism is rather different than the welfare-justice system. While both cost extraordinary amounts of money, a significant amount of which is given to private corporations, the similarity ends there. The barely disguised panic in the governance of autism is a possibility that children with autism diagnoses will not have productive futures as adults and will not be able to work, despite autism diagnosis in the USA being consistently associated with high socioeconomic status. So there's a kind of rupture in the imagination of who these children are supposed to be and who they are now looking like they might turn out to be, hence all this attention, panic and effort. One of the claims often made about the move away from institutionalization of children with disabilities and towards community care, as we now predominantly have, though not entirely, is that the liberal state sought to leverage the advocacy of parents and disability organisations and public outrage about the treatment of people with disabilities in institutions in order to move the economy of care away from the state and back into the family. In other words, what looked like a progressive move turned out to be, to some extent, a reactionary move. But this claim is undermined by the fact that the costs of current treatment regimes for children with autism spectrum disorder diagnoses are considerable. And in any case, deinstitutionalisation only affected mental health care. Rates of prison incarceration continue to increase and even expand. Parents of children with ASD have higher healthcare and non-health costs, including additional school costs. Medical costs for children with ASD are 4 to 6 times higher than for those without. In 2005, the average annual medical costs for Medicaid enrolled children with ASD were $10,000, which was about 6 times higher than costs for children without ASD. In addition to medical costs, intensive behavioural interventions for children with ASD in the US cost $40,000 to $60,000 per child per year. Incidentally, this compares to a cost of juvenile detention of somewhere between $100,000 and $250,000. Although ABA, which is the main kind of set of interventions used for children with autism, is also prescribed for children with intellectual disabilities, in the actual practice, this is a quote from Isle et al. 2010, in the actual practice of special education, given limited budgets, only autistic children and their parents are able to make a legitimate claim to the considerable resources and investments that ABA requires. And this is because a diagnosis of autism holds out the prospect of a cure within a specific window of intervention, whilst intellectual disability, diagnoses do not. In other words, the redemption of autistic children involves those whose imagined future is then within the scope of the forms of freedom that liberalism accepts. I might be on thin empirical ground here, and I do need to do more research to determine if my argument is correct. But what I want to suggest is that the governance of childhood disability goes in two directions. One is the correction of disability through the kinds of intensive educational interventions, many of which seem to the layperson rather violent, that autistic children are often subjected to. And for other forms of disability, prosthetics and implants and other technological adaptations that remove the impact of a person's disability on productivity. The other is the prevention of disability through selective abortion. If the imagined child cannot be imagined to be one who will become a productive adult, then abortion becomes not only a desirable choice, but one that is almost morally compelled. In other words, in the contemporary governance of childhood disability, we see again the moral revulsion of liberal capitalism towards a very specific form of unproductive human activity. Finally, my final point. In a sense, the argument that I'm developing here is very close to the claim made by many critical childhood studies scholars, myself included, that the contemporary governance of childhood is orientated towards the inculcation of liberal subjectivities, and that some aspects of childhood studies, especially the focus on child agency, has contributed to, rather than undermined, the place of liberalism in children's lives. However, I think in coming at the issue from the other side, from asking how does liberal governance govern those whose imagined futures are outside of the productive logic of capitalism, the importance for childhood studies of not only putting agency in its place, as it were, but also of attending again to not only the child's present, but also their projected futures is underscored. It's striking to me that neither juvenile justice nor childhood disability are central themes within childhood studies, in contrast to, say, education or work, or indeed development. I hope that by thinking about non-productivity and even its radical potential, we can open up space for more connections to be made between these disciplines and to understanding what liberalism erases.
Karen, thank you so much for a really compelling talk, a really, I think, insightful argument about, or call to childhood studies to not just think about the present, but also futures, and particularly in relation to the ways in which racialized childhoods are bound up with racialized adulthoods and the kind of processes of private accumulation. You did that through 2 case studies, so also talking about disability. Yeah, so thank you very, very much. Just a reminder to everybody that if you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. If you just kind of hover over the bottom of your Zoom, you should say something that says Q&A. You could type your questions there, and at the end of the talks, we'll be putting those to the speakers. It's now my real honor to introduce our final speaker, Veronica Piccini-Ketchbau. It's lovely to see her on Zoom. I think, anyway, I know her from Canada, so I feel like a long-standing connections, and it's wonderful to be sharing this virtual space with you, Veronica. Veronica is a professor of early childhood education in the Faculty of Education at Western University in Ontario, Canada. Her writing and research contributes to the Common Worlds Research Collective, which traces children's relations with place, materials, and other species. And she's also part of the Early Childhood Pedagogies Collaboratory, which is experimenting with the contours, conditions, and complexities of 21st century pedagogies. Her talk today is entitled Speculative Gestures in Childhood Studies. Veronica, welcome.
Thank you, Rachel. It's very nice to reconnect, absolutely. And I want to begin by thanking the 3 conveners for the invitation to engage with the important question of liberalism's erasures in relation to childhood studies. The questions that you pose to us are critical, I think, for our times, and I will do my best to engage with some of the key problematics related to liberalism in early childhood studies, which is my field. And yet I want a brief engagement with these ideas rather than a comprehensive review given the 10 to 12 minutes that we have. It is not surprised to anyone here that liberal conceptions of childhood have been dramatically influenced by child development, and specifically the child study movement at the end of the 19th century. Childhood scholars have written about the liberal conception of children and outline how the liberal institution of childhood, as Delage refers to it, has invented a specific view of children which serves to normalize specific structures of oppression, domination, and exploitation. In my own work, I have what Elizabeth Povinelli calls discourses, affects, and tactics to create other different childhoods, which are only recognized in relation to Western childhoods. I'm interested in how governance of difference were to contain those different childhoods within the context of settler colonial reason. And more recently, I have been inspired by feminist Black scholars and became interested in how such containment takes place through the making and remaking of the human. In other words, as Sylvia Wynter and Tiffany Lethabo-Kin, and the making of the Christian white economic man. So my goal is to offer to childhood studies, and perhaps even to my own work, the challenge to discourses, affects, and that place an emphasis on the making and remaking of the human. And I want to mention specifically two tactics that I have been dealing with and that I have been interested in and trying to work with right now, and how they relate specifically to early childhood studies. The first one, which I have written about in the early 1920s, is multiculturalism. Many settler nations have been committed to respect and sensitivity towards the needs of racialized young children through liberal commitments to multiculturalism. Of course, these commitments have shaped actual engagements with young children, specifically in pedagogical work in settler colonial nations in currently reside. The problem is that none of the main assumptions in multiculturalism, one of the main assumptions, in multiculturalism is that there is a normative standard that compares to a different, a somewhat problematic way of being and acting in the world. The rhetoric of multiculturalism is the celebration of differences and the cohesion of the nation state. The structural inequities that exist across social positions of race, nationality, class, language, and so on are ignored in multiculturalism. As many anti-feminist, anti-racist scholars argue, multiculturalism is the liberal project's answer to addressing the practical problems involved in governing states and their populations, other ways in managing lines. Difficult to map how multicultural childhood discourses configure particular identities and citizen subjects, as well as, did you just lose me? Did I lose you? I'm okay. Can you hear me? All right, good. I just got a note. So for me, it has been critical to map how multicultural childhood discourses configure particular identities and citizen subjects, as well as the purposes that such configurations serve within the context of global economies and politics. It has been equally important to understand the weaknesses of the mechanisms and technologies through which multicultural childhood discourses operate, particularly within pedagogical encounters. So I have pointed out that critiques require critical considerations of conceptions of citizenship and the effects of globalization in early childhood studies. Multiculturalism allows nation states such as Canada to govern their racialized childhoods, and in turn it serves to reinforce the regulations of movements across national boundaries. Importantly, while older forms of multiculturalism focused on the support and celebration of heritage cultures, the new phase of multiculturalism focuses on integration and social inclusion through equality of opportunity and treatment for all children. And this new phase of multiculturalism has served to create the citizen or the young child of the 21st century. Flexible, self-adjusted citizen population. Yet in the last 10 years, perhaps, I have realized that this critique to multiculturalism and to racialization doesn't really go far enough. So the second point that I want to point to, which is something that I am working with, trying to articulate, is liberalism's erasures that Tiffany Lethebop-King refers to as the erasure of the white body as subject, which has taken place and it continues to take place in childhood studies through engagements with voice, with agency, with children's rights, and so on and so forth. In a critical reading of philosophy, King, I quote, that while trying to offer a way around and beyond the entrapments of liberal humanism, conceptions of just subjectification have been effective in covering, she writes, the bloody trail of white human self-actualization. So let me elaborate a little bit what I mean here. Feminist Black scholars, inspired by Sylvia Wynter's work, argue that the hegemonic authority of liberal ideas and practices is predicated in the exclusion of Black and Indigenous peoples from the count of who is fully human. So liberalism as a theory and a practice, as modes of thought and political and economic arrangements, has flourished alongside transatlantic slavery. So the question of the human is central to liberalism and is central to the work that I am trying to do in relation to ecology. As Walcott writes, and I quote, "The central claim of the European Enlightenment and modernity is how to make a better human, a human that is fundamentally always positioned against Black being and indeed is dependent upon logics of anti-Blackness that produce Black as non-humans," end quote. That's the challenge that is in front of us in childhood studies, and for me in my own work, is how we might transform our interest in liberal and left politics in order to attend to the refusals, the slow violence that many of our colleagues have spoken about in this series. The question that I ask is, how might we undo the erasure of the white body as subject and invent global arrangements that are not yet imagined? So put in another way, how might we confront that our understandings of children and their futurity is already predicated in the full or partial exclusion, implicitly or explicitly, of who counts as fully human. Again, concepts such as rights, agency, voice, and participation always already embed the erasure of the white body as subject. Perhaps the question for childhood studies and for my own work now very similar to what Rinaldo asks in of diaspora studies. And I'm going to ask how we begin to extricate ourselves, as Walcott says, from the fact that the history of territorial theft, transatlantic slavery, and genocide is the incubator of a set of conditions that we have inherited as a global situation organized on the basis of Euro-Western traditions of thought and the human. So although I don't pretend to give this question the careful attention that it demands, I want to end with bell hooks' critical writings on yearning in order to gesture towards opening futures for early childhood studies. In Yearning, bell hooks invites the realm of fantasy and speculation, as she writes all too often, and I quote, "Our political desire for change is in from longings and passions that consume lots of time and energy in daily life. Particularly the realm of fantasy is often seen as completely separate from politics." And for me, she invites us to gather in this space of yearning for those who have never been allowed to be human, to open up to other possibilities, to other worldviews, to other ways of knowing and being. So I will end with a question for early childhood studies and a question also for me. How might we listen carefully to the speculative work that Indigenous and Black writers have already offered in order to abolish the liberal child? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation, which really gave us much to think about and reflect on in relation to our theme for today's webinar. The question you ended up with really helps us think, more broadly our role as childhood researchers in terms of the webinar's themes. Thank you so much. And now we're ready to proceed with our Q&A session so that we can have a more open discussion on the issues raised by our three speakers. I think we have about 20-25 minutes left. I would like to remind everyone again to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to post questions for our speakers. And if your question is addressed to a specific speaker, please mention their name as well as your name and affiliation. And please keep in mind that often we get many more questions than it is possible to ask our speakers in the short time we have available, and that we might not have enough time to ask all the questions posed. There is a question I see here for all the speakers, so perhaps it's a good question to start with, and I will read the questions from Beatrice Kutaru. Beatrice is asking, how would you define the specificity of liberal definitions of childhood? I'm asking this because some of the phenomena and situations presented can be found in societies considered socialist or communist. Also because research that looks at childhood on both sides of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War and after demonstrates that ideology does not always play an essential role in experiences of childhood. Would any of you like to start to respond to this question posed by Beatrice? Karen?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. Well, I guess the liberal definitions of childhood, like when I think about how what I think of as liberal subjectivities have been inculcated in children, they're no different in a sense than the liberal subjectivities inculcated in adults. Like that's kind of the point, really. Like, so it's about people being essentially autonomous, rational choice making in a very specific mode, where the individual rather than the kind of social group, whether that's a family or a broader collective, determine the decision making about economic choices. So, you know, for example, thinking about how people make decisions about whether to go to work, what kinds of work to go to, and what they do with their wages, whether these are for them personally or for a kind of wider social group, and kind of networks of care and sociality are, I think, erased, to use a buzzword or an appropriate word in this context, in the construction of liberal subjectivity. So it's about a particular kind of rational choice, about autonomy in the sense of a separateness from others, and about similarly a sense of kind of individual sovereignty. In fact, when I was thinking about this sort of idea of the private accumulation of capital, it's not just actually the private accumulation of capital in the sense of like, oh, owning land or owning a home or owning a corporation, like at these different scales. It's also this way that you're encouraged to think of yourself as a source of capital. You're encouraged to think about yourself as a kind of like an investment and a thing which is going to kind of generate more, more accumulation of private capital. That's what I mean by liberalism. And so when you say some of the phenomena and situation presented can be in societies considered socialist, communist, etc., well, I mean, you'd have to say more about, which I know you can't because you're not allowed to, you can't speak. So maybe you could write more, I don't know, but I don't quite know what you mean. And obviously there's a juvenile, there were sort of systems of welfare justice in the former Soviet bloc, and Cuba in fact hasn't got a juvenile justice system. It's only got a welfare system. So on paper, in relation to the UNCRC and its various guidelines, Beijing guidelines, Rio guidelines, Havana guidelines, it sits very well with what they're after. But there's obviously a problem with that in terms of while we are in this particular moment, we do need protections from arbitrary state power. And that's one of the problems with the welfare system as it's separated from the juvenile justice. If you have a welfare system in which juveniles are not allowed due process, that's obviously problematic in even in Cuba. And then research that looks at childhood on both sides of the Iron Curtain demonstrates that ideology does not always play an essential role in experiences of childhood. I mean, hard to know what you mean by that without you elaborating. So feel free to elaborate if you want, but I can't see how ideology can't play an essential role in experiences of childhood. Like, I mean, that's kind of the nature of ideology, isn't it? So anyway, enough said.
Thank you, Karen. Would either of our other two speakers like to comment on this, or we proceed with other questions? No. Okay, there's a question from Erica Miners, a former speaker in our webinar series on slow violence, and she's essentially asking us to reflect a bit more on our role as childhood scholars. And she's saying, it is Trans Day of Visibility here in the US, I guess today, at the moment when childhood is again predictably being weaponized against vulnerable communities. Bathroom bills to protect children are on the rise, etc. Feels like a pressing moment for childhood studies to weigh in, but also to resist liberalism. Not that childhood studies scholars are the solution, but curious what people view as important interventions to raise in this moment that we might not win, but are worth seeing. any reflections on this question posed by Erica? Paula?
I see a connection between this question and the last question only in terms of thinking about the history of child science and the role of child science in a lot of, and we're left with a lot of vestiges of that science in the same way that we are left with the vestiges of like race science, right? Those sciences are developed at a particular time in history, right? In the 19th century, in the early 19th century, not, outside of the US, and then sort of concretized and professionalized in the late 19th century as disciplines really across the globe. And I do think we have to look at some of what's been left from that quote unquote understanding of the science of childhood and development. I think this is a little bit, Veronica, what you were talking about, and we have those, even if that's changed in those disciplinary formations, and we have kind of different ways of thinking about young people, I still think the vestiges of sort of young people who can't think for themselves, right? And who need a particular kind of state protection that then, that brings with it necessarily state dominance, as well as parental, right? And sort of parents being sometimes the representatives of the state in some cases. So I think some of what child science brought to us was a kind of investment in many of those structures that we find problematic, right, and that abuse their power at any given time. And so I don't know, I just think that some of this is not exclusively about child science, but it's partly about what we're left with. But then I think it has to be a deconstructing of all of those different moving parts that are related, that kind of came to us through, the Enlightenment. So, I'm sorry to go that far back, but I am the historian. But I do think we have so many, right? Those are that's the ideological kind of, great-great-grandparent that leads to some of the disciplinary formations that created many of the ideas that we have about young people and what young people need, that is related to then who they will become as adults, that then manifests in all of these other ways. That's not a good answer, but that's just some of my thinking about kind of where we need to go to do the dismantling.
Also not a great answer, but yes, I do think that there is a place for childhood scholars to engage in this moment and intervene in terms of liberalism and the erasures. The question is how we do that, right? What is the role that we take to do that? What is the perspective or the approach that we take? Right? Do we continue to, perhaps we cannot think the child anymore. Oh my gosh, I notice my internet is very unstable. Sorry. Perhaps we cannot think the child anymore as apolitical. And can we take on this project of thinking childhood as a place to rethink the human, right? And how do we do that? Is a very tricky question. And who do we need to be working with to do that, to rethink that conception of the human?
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Paula, as well. There's an interesting question asked from Toby Royo.
Sorry, can I just chip in before you move on?
Oh, yes, sure.
I guess the only thing I wanted to add was I think one important thing for childhood studies scholars is the persistent way in which children are mobilized. And I think, Erica, you say this in your own work, persistently mobilized on both sides of every argument as whatever's happening is in the best interest of children. So children just get mobilized as this trope. And I think pointing that out in relation to the latest attack on the rights of trans children and trans adults is possibly a good move to kind of show that this is clearly, the bathroom bills have got like literally zero to do with protecting children. And it's just the mobilization of this trope yet again that it's being done in their best interest. So, but though I agree with the point about not just child science, but the way that's being hitched right now to neurological science, and the way that neurological science is becoming such a dominant strand even in social science theorizing and in public policy. So I think it's also important for us to make an intervention there. And the other thing I would say is, like, you know, I'm definitely no liberal at all, but in the context in which we at times it's important to mobilize liberalism as an argument for certain kinds of protection against state action. Like the fact that within the liberal state, there's this idea that we as adults certainly should be free from arbitrary interference by the state is a kind of principle of the operation of liberal political theory. And it's important to also mobilize on that territory and to reject these limitations on the rights of trans children on that territory, the arbitrary interference by the state on the rights of people to, you know, literally have a piss. So I think that's kind of also like, you know, there's no point in kind of like, I guess what I mean is, from a politically strategic point of view, surely we have to mobilize the discourses that are available to us. So one is saying this isn't about protecting children. It's got nothing to do with that. It's just yet again, the rolling out of that trope about where everybody uses the best interests of the child as a justification for whatever their political desires are. And the second is that even within the state's own terms of its commitment to liberal political theory, this is not within that scope, and that therefore on all grounds it needs to be opposed. So yeah, I guess it's an argument for political strategy. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Karen. To extend this kind of self-critique on the part of childhood researchers, Toby Roylo, if I pronounce the name correctly, is asking us the following. Are the problems, he suggests, identified in liberal necessarily restricted to liberal traditions? Can they be identified in some forms of critical theory, for instance, perhaps even in emancipatory post-colonial, decolonial, and abolitionist work? Any thoughts from any of the speakers? This is all directed to all of you.
I mean, I will just quickly say yes is my answer. I mean, I'm thinking mostly about one of the problems with liberalism is about rights and individual rights in particular. And I think that is sometimes the place that, right, because I think to Karen's point, that too can get mobilized on both sides in a very problematic way. So I think my short answer is yes.
Thank you, Paula. Karen or Veronica, any thoughts on this?
Well, to be honest, I need the question elaborated a bit more, because I don't know which are the problems identified in liberal theory that could be extended to emancipate post-colonial, decolonial, abolitionist work. So maybe you'd need to add something more about what you're thinking, like what particular things, like yeah.
Okay. Maybe follow-up questions. Okay, there is a question from Ketaki Prabha from Rutgers University. Ketaki is asking, given the pervasive quality of liberal ideology in everyday lives, practices, and institutions across the world, in spite of its violent erasures, is there any way to think through hybrid formations of children's subjectivity that often both counter and align with liberal desires for inclusion or recognition? All these questions require a second reading. They have depth.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can like that as a second reading and maybe a little more explanation. But my first engagement and thought is that, you know, we need to think about what inclusion and recognition assume. What is the assumption that we are making when we recognize the other, when we include the other? How is whiteness always already assumed within that recognition? That's my question and my caution.
And I would only add that I think in addition to what Veronica just said about that power is not in that equation, and I think that's one of the things about kind of the interrogation of liberalism that we absolutely need to engage in, is thinking about where power lies, who has it, and I think that. So I think that's that to me is part of that questioning about inclusion and recognition, because it often does not. We don't talk about power there, but it appears as if inclusion and recognition will be flat somehow, and we know that has not been historically what it has looked like.
Thank you, Paula. Karen?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I'd add is liberal ideology isn't pervasive across the world. Like it's pervasive it's like present in certain places and spaces, in certain, I mean, basically, like you can't confuse global capitalism with global liberalism. It doesn't, you know, there's forms of capitalism which aren't liberal, and there's forms of capitalism which are liberal, and they have different modalities, and they involve the production of different subjectivities. And yes, I guess it's true to say in terms of international institutions in their governance of childhood, there's been a push towards inculcating a certain liberal subjectivity, but it's very much often in opposition to what is available within the nation state. So yeah, I mean, you know, it's a limited and historically specific form of governing capitalism, I guess is what I'm wanting to say. One of the things I also wanted to kind of raise, just because I was thinking, I wonder why we always say this, neoliberalism. What's the neo in neoliberalism? It seems like same old stuff, really. I don't know why we call it neoliberalism. It just seems exactly the same liberalism as Wealth of Nations, like, you know, 1776. Like, anyway, just a little aside.
Okay, we have, thank you, Karen. We have a few minutes left. I would like to pose a general question to all of you, a kind of more open-ended question. What do you see as the most important challenges to current scholarship in childhood studies in the context of the critique of liberalism that you have addressed in your presentations? And what, if any, are the opportunities open to scholars to develop more critical understandings of childhood in light of these critiques? So to put it another way, in terms of the theme of the webinar today, what are those pressing questions that, in your opinion, the field needs to explore in ways that address liberalism's erasures? It could be based on your own work or your own thinking at this point in time. What are the things that we should be pursuing as a field in addressing liberalism's erasures?
For me, it's integrating juvenile justice and disability studies into childhood studies in a more central way, and then using that to kind of interrogate some of our ideas about childhood and, you know, children's lives, childhood productions, and the formations of subjectivity. And I think that would be an important move.
Thank you.
I think for me, I would say intellectual production, young people's intellectual production and intellectual history of young people as being important to add to kind of how we're thinking about the quote unquote needs of young people in our society. So intellectual production contemporarily and historically.
Thank you, Paula. Veronica?
Yes, for me, I think that we need to face the romantic notions of voice and agency and rights within and participation within childhood studies, and to really rethink how those are always already problematic, and it's a hard one for childhood studies, I think.
Excellent, thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time to ask all the questions that our participants raised. So this brings us to the end of the Q&A session. I would like to thank all our speakers, our three speakers, for yet another fascinating webinar, which concluded this series and certainly gave us much to think about as we reflect on our own work and the trajectory of childhood studies as a field. Paula, Karen, Veronica, thank you very much for your outstanding presentations and the stimulating dialogue you had with each other and our webinar participants. We would also like to thank all our previous speakers who have enthusiastically contributed to the great success of this webinar series, and of course, all of you who participated in them and made them successful and productive with your presence, comments, and questions. We're truly heartened by the response we've had. Now, before we conclude, I would also like to say that we have built a website for the Reimagining Childhood Studies project with support from UCL Institute of Education International Funds. This site is still being developed at this point, but if you visit now, you will find the recordings of all the webinars and the introductory remarks that accompanied each one. The URL is www.reimaginingchildhoodstudies.com. The website is intended as a space to continue the conversations we have only just started with these webinars. And if you're interested in writing a blog or responding to any of the conversations based on the webinar themes, please get in touch via the website to propose an idea. We very much welcome contributions in many English languages and different media such as blogs, podcasts, videos, and more. And we also hope to continue with new initiatives and activities with the coming academic year. And we will issue announcements about our planned events in due time. So thanks again, everyone, and hope to see you soon.